hubris, deceit, and an unexpected collapse. Witness how one man's immense fortune couldn't shield him from the reach of justice. The courtroom was abuzz with activity, resembling a swarm of uneasy bees. The atmosphere was thick with tension as spectators filled the benches side by side, their gazes fixed on the defendant's table. Murmurs circulated among the crowd, each whisper more scandalous than the previous one. He made his entrance, tall, with broad shoulders, clad in a sleek charcoal gray designer suit. His demeanor exuded a confidence that bordered on arrogance. His neatly slicked hair shone under the bright courtroom lights, and he flashed a smirk at the audience, acting as though they were there to admire him rather than judge him. Ethan Grayson, a name that had been dominating the news for weeks, appeared more like a celebrated guest than a defendant accused of embezzling millions from struggling families. However, it wasn't his arrival that captured attention, but the moment Judge Monica Lee stepped into the courtroom. Clad in her black judicial robe, Judge Lee moved with a composed authority towards the bench. She didn't need to raise her voice or scan the room to command respect. Her mere presence was sufficient. Known for her no-nonsense approach and unwavering commitment to justice, her reputation preceded her. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Monica Lee," the bailiff announced, prompting everyone to stand except Ethan Grayson. Silence enveloped the room as all eyes turned to the defendant, who remained nonchalant, casually flipping through a legal pad as if the trial was a mere inconvenience. His attorney leaned in to whisper urgently, but Ethan dismissed him with a flick of his wrist. Judge Lee paused at her desk, her gaze sharp and unwavering. Her face showed no emotion, yet the silence grew more oppressive with each passing moment. A ripple of disbelief spread through the crowd. Who does he think he is? But Ethan remained unfazed, his expression smug, almost challenging the judge to respond. "You may be seated," Judge Lee declared, her voice steady and authoritative. She didn't address the slight directly, but the room's energy had shifted dramatically. The tension was not only palpable, but also suffocating. This was just the beginning. Ethan Grayson was about to discover that even the richest and most entitled individuals are not above the law. Ethan Grayson was no ordinary wealthy man. His wealth made headlines. Opulent yachts, multi-million-dollar estates on both coasts, private jets, and extravagant parties rivaling those of celebrities. His company, Grayson Investments, was once hailed as a symbol of financial triumph, but beneath the surface of luxury lay a sinister reality. Grayson's ascent had been fueled by deceit, enticing small business owners and middle-class families to invest their savings into fraudulent schemes. He had persuaded hundreds to invest their life savings into fake retirement accounts, college funds, and even entire family inheritances vanished in an instant. The consequences were catastrophic. Families lost their homes, parents struggled to provide for their children, and elderly couples faced the grim possibility of spending their final years in poverty. The impact of his greed was widespread, but to Ethan, it was merely business. When investigators finally apprehended him, the evidence was overwhelming. Bank statements, forged documents, and testimonies from former employees painted a damning case. Yet, even as the net tightened around him, Ethan remained self-assured. "I have the best lawyers money can buy," he told reporters outside his Malibu mansion. "This will blow over. It always does." For a time, it seemed he might be correct. His legal team submitted motion after motion, delaying the trial for months and portraying him as a misunderstood entrepreneur or a scapegoat for others' failures. However, no amount of legal tactics could diminish the mountain of evidence or alleviate the heartbreak of his victims. By the time the trial commenced in San Francisco, the courtroom was consistently full with individuals seeking justice or at least some form of closure. Among them was Angela Martinez, a widowed mother of 3 who had lost her home after investing with Grayson. Her youngest daughter had been forced to drop out of college. Beside her sat Peter Vaughn, a retired firefighter who had spent decades saving for retirement, only to find himself living in his brother's spare room. Their stories, along with countless others, were presented in heart-wrenching detail throughout the trial. Angela's voice cracked as she recounted the moment she realized she couldn't keep up with the mortgage payments. "I begged them not to take the house," she said, tears streaming down her face. "But they didn't care. My kids had to sleep in our car for 2 weeks. Do you know what that feels like?" Peter's testimony was equally devastating. "I spent 35 years running into burning buildings," he said, his voice thick with anger. "And this man burned my future to the ground without a second thought." Throughout it all, Ethan remained unperturbed. He frequently leaned back in his chair, scrolling through his phone or whispering jokes to his attorney. To him, these were mere stories, irrelevant noise that wouldn't alter the outcome. He was convinced the verdict was already in his favor. The media fed off his arrogance, highlighting his lack of remorse and blatant disrespect for the court. Public opinion was swiftly turning against him, but Ethan remained indifferent. In his view, public sentiment didn't translate into financial power. His lawyer attempted to shape the narrative. "Mr. Grayson deeply regrets any hardship caused," the attorney stated during a press conference. "But he remains confident that the truth will prevail." The reality, however, was that Ethan had no intention of accepting guilt. He was banking on the system working in his favor, as it had in the past. Yet, there was one element Ethan hadn't considered. Judge Monica Lee was unlike those he was accustomed to handling. The trial became a media spectacle. News vans lined the courthouse streets, with reporters vying for the best angles to capture every moment inside. The tension escalated as the days wore on. Witness after witness took the stand, each adding more evidence against Ethan Grayson. But it wasn't just the testimonies that shocked the audience. It was Ethan's conduct. On the trial's third day, the prosecution unveiled damning evidence, a series of emails where Ethan explicitly instructed his team to falsify records and deceive investors. The courtroom fell silent as the prosecutor read the incriminating words aloud. "Make the numbers look good. We need these suckers to sign on the dotted line." The statements lingered in the air like a toxic cloud. Angela Martinez, seated in the front row, shook her head in disbelief. Peter Vaughn clenched his fists, while Ethan simply smirked. The prosecutor turned to him, her tone sharp. "Mr. Grayson, do you recognize this email?" His lawyer immediately objected. "Objection. This question has been addressed in pretrial hearings." Judge Lee raised her hand, her demeanor composed yet authoritative. "Overruled. The defendant will answer the question." Ethan leaned into the microphone, his tone dripping with condescension. "Yes, I recognize it, but let's not pretend it means what you're implying. It's just business talk. You wouldn't understand." The crowd murmured among themselves, and Judge Lee's gavel struck sharply, demanding order. "Order in the court," she commanded, her voice slicing through the chatter. She turned her focus back to Ethan. "Mr. Grayson, I advise you to watch your tone. This is not a boardroom meeting." Ethan remained unfazed, appearing amused as if he were part of an elaborate game. As the trial progressed, his arrogance intensified. He interrupted witnesses with sarcastic chuckles, rolled his eyes during cross-examinations, and whispered loudly to his lawyer at critical moments. The audience watched in disbelief as he treated the courtroom like his personal stage. Then came the day of Angela Martinez's testimony. She stepped up to the stand, clutching a folded piece of paper with trembling hands. Her voice wavered as she began, but her words conveyed profound pain. "I trusted him," she said, looking directly at Ethan. "I trusted him with everything I had, and he destroyed my family's future." Ethan didn't even glance her way. He leaned back in his chair, casually scrolling through his phone. "Your Honor," the prosecutor interjected, pointing towards Ethan. "The defendant is clearly not paying attention to the witness." All eyes turned to Judge Lee, her expression impassive, yet her eyes blazing with quiet fury. "Mr. Grayson," she said in a measured tone, "put your phone away now." Ethan looked up unfazed. "I was just checking something important," he replied, holding up the device as if to justify his actions. The judge's tone grew sterner. "I said now." For a moment, it seemed he might argue, but he reluctantly set the phone down. The room was thick with tension, but the damage was already done. Angela's testimony continued, her voice tinged with disbelief as she struggled to comprehend Ethan's lack of basic human decency. By the end of her statement, not a single dry eye remained in the courtroom, except for Ethan's. A week later, the prosecution concluded its case, leaving the defense to respond. Ethan's lawyer employed every tactic available, discrediting witnesses, twisting the narrative, and even portraying Ethan as a victim of overzealous prosecution. However, the evidence was too substantial to conceal. Throughout the ordeal, Judge Lee maintained her composure. She seldom spoke, but her presence was a constant, unwavering force in the room. It was evident to all observers that her patience with Ethan's antics was wearing thin. The trial had reached its final day, and the courtroom was electric with anticipation. Reporters filled the back rows, their pens ready and cameras poised. The gallery was packed with victims, their expressions a mix of anger and hope. All eyes were fixed on Judge Monica Lee as she prepared to deliver the verdict. Ethan Grayson sat at the defense table, his posture relaxed as ever. He even had the audacity to flash a small grin to the cameras, capturing every moment. He didn't appear as a man about to face judgment. Rather, he seemed convinced he had already won. When Judge Lee finally spoke, the room fell silent. "Mr. Grayson," she began, her voice steady and deliberate, "you have been found guilty on all counts of fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. The evidence against you is overwhelming, and the testimonies of your victims clearly illustrate your actions. You manipulated, exploited, and destroyed the lives of countless individuals for your personal gain." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. The judge continued, "Throughout this trial, you have demonstrated a blatant lack of remorse. Your behavior in this courtroom has been nothing short of disgraceful. You have insulted your victims, disregarded this court's authority, and treated these proceedings as if they were beneath you." The crowd murmured in agreement. Angela Martinez, seated in the front row, clasped her hands tightly, her knuckles turning white. Judge Lee's tone shifted, becoming colder. "Justice, Mr. Grayson, is not about wealth, power, or privilege. It is about accountability, and today you will face the consequences of your actions." The room was so quiet you could hear the faint rustling of papers. Ethan's smirk faltered for the first time as he straightened in his chair. "Therefore," the judge declared, "I sentence you to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole." Gasps filled the courtroom. Ethan's face went pale, the color draining from his cheeks. 25 years? I was expecting a slap on the wrist, maybe a few months in a cushy facility, but this is unheard of for someone of your stature." Judge Lee wasn't finished. "Furthermore, I am ordering the immediate liquidation of your assets to repay the victims of your crimes. Every dollar you stole will be returned to the families you devastated." The courtroom was filled with stunned murmurs. Angela Martinez pressed her hands to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Peter Vaughn leaned back in his seat, eyes wide with disbelief. Ethan sprang from his chair, his face flushed with anger. "You can't do this," he shouted, his voice echoing through the room.
"I'm Ethan Grayson.
"You can't treat me like some common criminal." Judge Lee's gavel slammed down, her expression unwavering. "Mr. Grayson, sit down." But Ethan wasn't done. "This is a joke. I'll appeal this. I'll have your career ruined." The bailiffs moved closer, ready to intervene. Judge Lee remained calm, her voice slicing through his outburst like a knife. "This is my courtroom, Mr. Grayson, and you will show respect." The bailiffs escorted the defendant out as he was led away. Ethan continued to protest, his voice diminishing with each step. The courtroom erupted into applause, an uncommon occurrence, but one that felt entirely fitting in that moment. Judge Lee addressed the audience, her expression softening slightly. "Justice has been served," she stated. "Let this be a reminder that no one, no matter how powerful, is above the law." As the courtroom emptied and the cameras outside began flashing, one question remained in everyone's minds. Would this sentence be sufficient to truly reform a man like Ethan Grayson? The courtroom was almost empty now, save for a few lingering reporters and victims collecting their belongings. The air was still buzzing with excitement, but for those directly impacted by Ethan Grayson's actions, the emotions were more nuanced. Angela Martinez stood by the courthouse steps, clutching her purse tightly. A reporter approached her with a microphone. "How do you feel after today's verdict?" Angela paused, then responded, "I feel relieved, but the truth is no sentence will erase the damage he caused. My kids and I are still rebuilding, but at least now we have hope." Nearby, Peter Vaughn was conversing with a friend. "It's not just about the years he's getting," he said, shaking his head. "It's about the message. People like him think they're untouchable. Today proves they're not." Inside her chambers, Judge Monica Lee sat quietly, gazing out the window at the commotion below. She didn't feel triumph or victory, only a steadfast resolve. Her role wasn't about personal satisfaction. It was about ensuring fairness and reminding everyone that the scales of justice could balance even against immense wealth and privilege. Ethan Grayson's name would continue to dominate headlines for some time, but for those he had wronged, a chapter was finally closing. The financial restitution would help many start anew, but the emotional scars he left behind would take much longer to heal. In the weeks that followed, the story ignited conversations across the nation. It became a rallying cry for accountability, emphasizing that those in power must adhere to the same standards as everyone else. People shared their own experiences of injustice, drawing strength from the verdict. Perhaps the most poignant moment came from Angela's youngest daughter, Sophia, who penned a letter to Judge Lee that was later published in a local newspaper. "Thank you for standing up for my family. Thank you for showing us that people like Ethan Grayson can't get away with hurting people like us. You didn't just give us justice, you gave us a second chance." The narrative of Ethan Grayson's trial transcended a simple courtroom drama. It underscored the resilience of ordinary individuals, the significance of integrity, and the conviction that justice can and should prevail regardless of the odds. As you reflect on this story, consider, what does accountability mean to you? And in your own life, how can you ensure that fairness and justice are not merely ideals but actions? Ultimately, justice isn't solely the court's responsibility. It's something we all must strive for every day.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.